Doug Finke, David Shaw, James Sanders, Shahin Khan, and I will be looking at the news in quantum tech globally, take a deep dive into a topic, and review progress on our predictions. This is the Analyst Roundtable.
I'm James Sanders with 451 Research, which is part of S&P Global Market Intelligence.
I'm Shahin Khan with OrionX.net.
I'm David Shaw with Fact-Based Insight.
I'm Doug Finke with the Quantum Computing Report.
Welcome everybody to the Quantum Analyst Roundtable, Season 1, Episode 5. I am joined by my friends and fellow experts, Shahin Khan, David Shaw, Doug Finke, James Sanders. I think all of you just came back from some travel, different conferences in San Diego, London. Any impressions you'd like to share?
Yeah, I was yesterday. I was at the Economist Commercializing Quantum event in London, and it was really very, very interesting. I would contrast it with some of the other events on the quantum scene that we've seen. A lot of great events out there. The Economist obviously has a different kind of reach, and a reach into, if you like, a much more mainstream business audience. And so it was interesting to, on the one hand, have some of the regular quantum majors presenting and talking through their views. But it was also very interesting to see the large end use potential adopters and understanding what they were talking about, what they were echoing back, and some of the other issues they were talking about. And it made for a much more complex, I didn't quite want to say confused, but a complex set of views coming out of the day.
The family is growing.
So I stayed up and dialed into the Economist conference as well. And I caught about a half a dozen of the initial talks in agreement with what David was saying. It is nice that this topic is extending its reach and that executives and mainstream business audiences want to know more about this. But with that also comes just a wider spread of content that goes from elementary to expert, from a little bit, let's say, exuberant, if not hyped, to let me tell you where the problems are. And that does require a discerning audience to navigate. And I'm not sure to what extent that happens, but it's part for the course, and it's going to be messy, and that's this phase we're in right now.
How about San Diego? IQT is somebody that we know and love. Lawrence always does a great job. Was San Diego any different from London?
Yeah, I came, was at IQT San Diego, and it was a little bit more focused audience, people more, let's say, involved, not as many, let's say, end users or politicians. But the one comment that everyone continues to make is, you lose something when you go all virtual in these conferences. There's something about the in-person meetings, going out for drinks with people and swapping rumors that is really, for many of these conferences, at least for me, it's the most valuable part of the conference. But, the subject matter was good. We covered a broad range of topics, from workforce to technology. There was one significant announcement from Cold Quanta saying they were acquiring SuperTech, another hardware-software merger in the industry. But overall, it was a good conference.
This was my first IQT that I was able to do in person. So it was, as we're getting back to actually traveling again in the, I can't really say post-COVID world, but COVID existent world, it was definitely a good time. And it's always nice to see customer examples. Yeah, as much as vendors want to talk about what's going on with their quantum hardware, seeing examples from like Boeing of how they're using quantum computers and how they're approaching the technology itself it's kind of more interesting than all of the vendor claims you can make. It really comes down to what customers can do. But I definitely agree with Doug. It is a lot more invigorating to have these hallway conversations with people, and I hope that the world stays in a comfortable place that we can keep doing this sort of thing.
I'll be speaking in person at the Quantum Tech Boston, the leading quantum tech conference in the world, in just a few weeks. In November, there's the leading quantum conference in the world in DC, the Quantum Congress. And yesterday, I got a message on LinkedIn from a global event organizer in Paris who is organizing the leading conference in quantum. So a lot of conferences to go to, hopefully in person.
Can I just come back in with one observation? Because there was one thing that I really took away from yesterday, listening to some of the non-quantum regular businesses speak. And a lot of the time you had senior individuals and they were speaking about issues and they were absolutely emphasizing, oh, we're doing this in big data, we're doing this in AI, we're doing this in conventional machine learning. They're talking a lot about that. And actually you go into the networking break and then people say, oh, but that wasn't really quantum, was it? But I really took away that it's something that maybe the quantum industry doesn't do or doesn't focus on well enough, is understanding how that quantum piece fits into the narrative in the way that the business executive would explain it back, because they have to explain why something that they're starting to do, looking at quantum, they have to explain how it fits into that overall budget, that overall agenda they've got to talk about. And so it's you absolutely have to help them fit all that together so that it can sensibly join up, not fall to pieces.
Certainly a responsibility that the five of us share. So let's look at some quantum news. Lots of announcements over the last 4 weeks. Nothing groundbreaking in my opinion, but I'll get your opinions in a second. Doug, you mentioned the super tech out of Chicago, the Duality incubator, an API library marketplace, really, acquired by Cold Quanta, and Cold Quanta continues under Scott to expand its capabilities. IQM, our friends in Finland, Germany, received 35 million from the European Investment Bank for their fabrication facility. They're also raising a very large round. Looking forward to announcement there. Our friends at Google, or rather Sandbox AQ, also with a few announcements around quantum machine learning, but they got backing from the CIA, the venture capital arm. Of course, that amount there is undisclosed, but probably significant. Synergy Quantum, a Swiss quantum-based technology company, announced also undisclosed their pre-seed A funding round, and a couple more activities out there. Anything that jump out to you in the investment startup world over the last 4 weeks?
I think what jumps out to me is the absence of more photonics. I know photonics is a core technology and it impacts a lot of different ways, but when it comes to computing itself, there was a time when it was really billed as room temperature, can be miniaturized, all that, and maybe they're just not sharing as much info, but I'm not hearing as much about it. It seems to be getting pushed into the communication part, although we do know that PsiQuantum and others are driving it as well.
Well, there was one announcement that was recent, which was, PsiQuantum uses Global Foundries in New York as their foundry. And I guess the US government gave a grant, I think it was mostly to Global Foundries for, I think it was about $25 million or so for new equipment and that type of thing. So that was a little bit unusual. It was not a venture capital investment, but it was money for photonics.
I thought that was brilliant, by the way, because if you're a US government and you're trying to spruce up the chip industry, because that's in vogue and it's important right now, I thought it was two birds with one stone. Here's a chip industry boost that also impacts an indigenous player. And if you are really trying to help photonics in the US, PsiQuantum is it, right?
And there might be, or not, an announcement by Xanadu coming. There might or might not be rumors about that out there in the quantum universe, but photonics certainly is not dead, right?
No, far from it. Yeah.
I mean,
I'm still hopeful.
I see a lot of opportunity for photonics, and I think one got to remember that it's in itself a very disparate endeavor. There are a variety of photonic platforms, both the established ones and emerging platforms, which are being pursued for if you like, purely photonic reasons. And that it's an interesting dynamic that you've got that developing capability, which is, you know, it's partly the fabrication know-how, it's partly actual foundry availability, and it's caught up in that whole geopolitical consideration of where between the West and you know and you know, and China and Taiwan, that these things can be fabricated, and you know, I think it's interesting to see what possibilities that's going to open up for, you know, innovative strategies in quantum photonics that can then leverage you know, exciting new developments in photonic platforms themselves.
And the consolidation curve that I keep predicting hasn't taken off yet, but congratulations to the guys at Super Tech, and there'll be more deals coming like that. Looking at the product and tech news, briefly leaving the world of quantum computing and getting into quantum security and quantum communications, British Telecom and Toshiba launched their first commercial trial of a quantum secured communication service, and ARKit, that had received a lot of bad press with some positive announcements and more than one, but they demonstrated an industrial IoT security network at scale, which was very interesting. Anybody has any insider knowledge that they can share? Or
yeah, I certainly it was great to see the launch of the BT Toshiba QKD network in London. I think it's very interesting to know that technology, it's actually now regular BT account managers and regular engineers that are servicing that offer to trial customers in London. And on the ARKit side, I think there's an event which I've been watching out for some time. I think, you know, we looked at ARKit technology last year, and they'd never really shown anyone a security proof of their system. And there has been a notable announcement from University of Surrey in the UK signing off on the security proof of at least part of ARKit's system. I don't think that the full report hasn't been made available, but it does seem to be a significant reference.
I think we've talked about the spectrum from quantum inspired to quantum real and everything in between. And I think it's also a nature of the beast that the phase we're in is going to have whatever use case that comes about would be useful. And I think that is also typical in technology, that early use cases have nothing to do with latest use cases. I think in the Economist conference last night, somebody was saying that when the semiconductor business got started, the first use cases were like transistor radio. And it was a while before we got to programmable, actual, you know, the whole architecture that we know now. So I think all these use cases are exciting and encouraging, as much as they are really tipping, you know, just doing our toes in the water and not quite where it's going to be.
good. We want to take as much time as possible without being 50 minutes long again to do our deep dive. So we'll move to that. And today's deep dive, of course, we have to talk about Scorpion, but we're going to relate it to IBM and to Rigetti. And I'll throw a last-minute contender in there. Sorry, guys. D-Wave, that is doing their SPAC, and you'll see how we relate those four to each other in a minute here. David, Doug, and I, we wrote not a response to IonQ, but sort of our comment about the Scorpion report. Doug, can you maybe give a quick overview, your thoughts on what we wrote there about Scorpion and the whole IonQ thing?
Yeah, so for those of you who've been living in a cave, a hedge fund called Scorpion Capital wrote a very negative paper or white paper about INQ. They made a lot of charges against it, and probably most concerning to us was the fact that not only was it incorrect, but the fact that it cast a dispersion on the entire quantum computing industry. And we wanted to make sure that people understand that quantum computing is very, very real. It has a lot of potential, and that no one should be reading that report and thinking that all of quantum is bad. So that was our biggest concern. But at the same time, I think the people at INQ need a fair shake. I've always been against people hyping the quantum industry too positively and saying completely unrealistic things. But I'm also concerned about the exact opposite too, that people are ultra negative and and just making people think that quantum is really bad thing. So we try to be balanced in that, and certainly point anyone interested in hearing more about this to the article we wrote. It's on each of our websites.
I think of everyone on the podcast, I'm maybe a little more negative about IonQ, and that's just keeping in with my personality of being a cheerful pessimist. That said, the Scorpion report was essentially a hatchet job. Like this is all of the fervor of Martin Luther hammering his 95 Theses through the door of the Catholic Church, but is starved for rhetorical flair or, for the most part, facts. So seeing this very, how to describe this, vocal, fervent approach to IonQ was kind of alarming. And I do worry that some of the basic things about quantum computing that were not really factually consistent in the report. I mean, is this the start of quantum winter? We've seen this. We've seen the ARKit thing recently. What's going on here?
So I thought you guys' reports was very balanced, very nicely done. Of course, it would be, and I think it was a major contribution to the discussion, because the Scorpion piece really muddies the water. As much as anything like that might have an ounce of truth here and there, it suffered from what it was complaining about. It was itself a super hyped job. And it lost credibility after a few slides, even though it may have raised a couple of decent points. And of course, these SPACs and financial activities have all manner of footprints that investors must read. So really, the bottom line to me is that where any investor is really misled, and I keep coming up with the answer that no, they do know what they're doing. They do know what the risks are. These are early days. If you want to put your chips on a particular number, then you do. And if you win, you're going to look like a super smart person who really knew the future. And if you don't, people will forget, etc. So I think that it was not, I do think that it will change the situation, because now it's a file that every investor is going to send to every CEO. So what do you think about this? So now you have to respond to it, and you have to defend something that really may not be so meritorious.
And in the spirit of staying balanced, since Scorpion came out, IonQ obviously published their response, which was, a well-written PR response. But more importantly, they announced earnings and a massive 9% top-line surge. Read one headline: revenues up by 1,400% to 1.95 million, bookings of 4.2 million. And they still got close to 600 million of cash on their balance sheet. They also announced, and funnily, with very nice pictures in the announcement of the actual hardware, IonQ Forte, which is kind of their new machine and a software configurable system, which is the feature of that Forte system that they are touting. And spoiler alert, this segment is not about Scorpion or IonQ. It is about quantum roadmaps and quantum commercialization. So where do we put the IonQ on the spectrum of quantum will never happen in the real world to, it is here today?
One thing I would mention, there's a methodology in engineering that is often used, which is basically only innovate one thing at a time. And if you go back to what IonQ was saying at Q2B in December, they actually announced two things that they were doing, two key things. One was moving to barium as their ions, and the second was changing the control system to something which was basically a steerable laser beam. And I actually just posted an article on the QCR about this. And apparently what they've done is they've taken their previous machine, which they called Aria. They are continuing to use the ytterbium ion, but the one, again, in the interest of changing only one thing at a time, they're now using this steerable beam type of thing. So that will give them a lot of improvements. Quantum is really a step-by-step approach. You have to continue that, and it's a long path. But as you say, it will allow the machine to be more software oriented, because you can change the steering of the beam by software. You don't have to adjust things, mechanically, where the lasers are pointing. And it gives you more precision, potentially could give you more qubits, better scaling. That's been the thing that people complain about ion traps is, well, you need a new laser for every single qubit you add, but with a steerable beam, you won't have that. So the other interesting thing they mentioned in their conference call is that IonQ is developing 3 generations simultaneously, and they're all in different phases, but they're definitely using an overlapping development methodology. So they're doing that, and again, there were also hardware announcements from IBM and Rigetti, who are also incrementally improving, and step by step things are getting better every year.
So before I get the next comment, so sorry, David, to cut you short, let's quickly take a look at the Rigetti announcement. Financial results, better than IonQ, but going down from 2.4 million in revenue to 2.1 million in revenue, but they claim an 80% gross margin, with 1.7 million USD in gross profits, and still a lot of cash on their balance sheet. They also start to talk about their roadmap, which is interesting, and a next generation. We will have to see what that means. Single chip 84 qubit processor in 2023, and a 336 qubit multi-chip processor in late 2023. So revenues, profit, gross margin, and an ambitious roadmap. David, James, you both raised your hand and winked at me.
Do you want me one of the things that is overhanging some of these roadmaps for me is, do I really see that they can overcome, that there's a clear path for them to overcome some key obstacles on the scaling roadmap? And I think this applies to IonQ, applies to Rigetti, in my view. One is basic fidelity. That it's the types of fidelities we've actually got in these devices today really aren't good enough to actually scale up and do error correction. And you've got to believe that you can actually do those fidelities when the device is in simultaneous operation. You're trying to do lots of gates at once, and a lot of the time, some of the fidelity results we do here, it's not really that. And then you've got to take the ion traps, really to scale to mass systems. It seems to me you really need integrated optics at some point, and doing integrated optics, integrated photonics for the wavelengths that the ion traps need, particularly these hyperfine qubits, is difficult. It's not as easy. It's much more difficult than is commonly understood. And the performance of photonic interconnects is not really there to do what's needed. And simultaneously, it's great that you've got Rigetti with its chip couplers, and clearly that's a coupling chip to chip is clearly, an equivalent task in the silicon does it. But making that work with sufficient fidelity that you can just not worry about it anymore is similarly a real challenge. And that's one of the things that I think we've got to be very careful at. If we see devices which are nominally scaling up in size, nominally getting to larger and larger qubit counts, and are we really going to? It's dangerous to take that qubit count and assume that the device is going to be usable in that sense. It might still be a great technical roadmap to progress the engineering, but we've got to be very cautious that it's going to deliver a device, and call it whatever metric you want. Is it going to have a high quantum volume? Well, no, it might have still have a very modest quantum volume.
Yeah, I would want to add one thing more on the financial side that all investors should be interested in or worried about, and that is revenue reports that we see are going to be lumpy. And what that means is that sometimes you'll ship a large machine or conclude a large order, and that will give you a boost in one quarter, but you may see a decrease in the last quarter. You're not selling large quantities of small things that all add up. And we saw this in the classical world too. Cray Research used to have this problem too, that it'd make a big difference to them if they shipped the machine on March 31st versus April 1st. So we will see that in financial reports from all these companies.
But in this case, really the only reason these people, it's great that they track their finances and revenue and cost and all that is very good, but the reporting of it is entirely because they're public, they're SPAC, they have to. Yeah. I don't think the data is really all that meaningful. The meaningful data is your runway. It's the 600 million in the bank that makes you feel like, okay, you're good for the next few years, and you can have a lot of irons in fire and try to make it work. But fundamentally, the industry continues to be somewhere between R and D. It's not quite research alone, but it's also not like we're cranking out actual systems that people install and use in production. And we've talked about the word production a few episodes ago, and we're far from that sort of an environment. So, back to the analogy with the semiconductor business, we are not at our transistor moment. We don't really have a technology that can look like the horse to bet on, that we can all rally behind and go build the whole ecosystem. It's really highly spread out, and it's hard to tell how these things are going to work. We don't know yet that anybody has a roadmap that is guaranteed to succeed, and it's just a question of blocking and tackling. It's more like you're trying to debug a problem and you have really no clue where the bug is, and it's not done until it's done. And so yeah.
James, I read some strong emotions on your face. Do you want to put words against them?
Yeah. So the difficult part of that is that David took every single talking point that I had for all of the scaling and engineering challenges of, and these are really different things, frankly, of building a QPU and then connecting them together using integrated photonics. And so it is going to take a very multidisciplinary approach to doing this. And that requires talent, and talent requires money. And money, isn't a problem. We can see from the financials of these publicly traded companies. But going back kind of to Doug's point, this is going to be lumpy, and it's going to be lumpy for a while. Even going back to the Cray example, this isn't, even though access to quantum computers, right, is sold through the cloud in kind of a recurring billing way, this isn't going to be the same regularity that you see with a SaaS company that has pretty predictable billing, that has pretty predictable revenue as a result. And so, yeah, being okay with things being lumpy, and as we've seen in the media, occasionally having to take your lumps and go with it, it's going to be a little bit of a rough ride, I imagine. And I am a little bit concerned with just kind of the state of the market, the kind of correction we've seen over the past 6 weeks, and how that plays out, especially for the publicly traded quantum companies.
I just want to add that this is lumpy and small. Like Cray was lumpy, but each of those systems was like $35 million a pop. And indeed, if they moved from March 31st to April 1st, it was like a different quarter, and they didn't have sufficient volume to balance it all out. but their revenues were hundreds of millions of dollars at the time. So if one or two deals moved, yeah, it was like a $70 million hit or a $50 million hit, and it was lumpy, but it was in a very different zone. I think what we are looking at are really minuscule revenues. A couple of million is, right? Come on, an agency does more than that.
I think it's one of the things I think we're going to see a lot more of it, if I understand the US plans correctly. It's that ability of the sovereign to effectively say, oh, I am going to buy lots of quantum computing cloud service. And that's one way of really supporting your ecosystem and your market, because effectively it puts lots of revenue into the system that people they can bid for, and they can provide machines, and it is a way of supporting your ecosystem. And I think a very healthy one, because it even though it's soft commercial, it gets the commerciality flowing of people bidding and using and administering that service.
So I see raised hands, but before we get the next comment, let me introduce my wild card that we didn't prepare, as we're moving from R to D, trying to see how close we can get to development and how far away we can get from research. And I find D-Wave interesting in that respect. They released their Analyst Day presentation for the SPAC that they're doing, or I should say the SPAC vehicle released that presentation. I'm not sure if we can share the numbers here, but let's just say their revenue is a multiple of what IonQ and Rigetti combined would be. And that's only with annealing. For me, this discussion of D-Wave is quantum or not is kind of boring. If people want to have fun with that, that's cool. But annealing can address certain optimization problems and can most likely address them better than quantum for a long time. D-Wave is the only game in town. They have that revenue. They have the customers. I spoke to Alan, the CEO, a few days ago. He thinks that part of the business, as they also bring the quantum system online, which will take a while, but that part of the business will only be about a quarter for D-Wave in a few years. So are we getting closer to the D and R&D here?
Well, I think actually I would take that as a segue into the applications of quantum. And as we have discussed before, obviously you can do quantum science because, well, it's quantum. You can do optimization. And the nice thing about optimization is that anything can be formulated as an optimization problem. Now, the question is whether that optimization problem as formulated can be solved with annealing or not. But it already gives them access to probably the largest chunk of business-oriented applications out there. And then if you're solving the problem, then people may not care exactly how you solve it. Is it quantum? Who cares? If it's 10,000 times faster, I'll take it. And then we get into like quantum machine learning or etc. But the thing to note, and really the research that I'm really working on is more related to the supercomputing, because that's where I come from. It's the question of quantum computing is not for big data. We're not able to really say, here's a 5,000 by 5,000 matrix. I'm going to put it in a quantum computer and then zoom, I get some great insights. I have to, like, one at a time, do this quantum load systems and put the data in. So the fact that quantum computing is not for big data really argues in favor of the annealing systems that are more tractable and the ab initio quantum science that don't really require a lot of data. The data is like two protons, 2 electrons, go, and oh my God, I got an helium atom, right? And I can do the ground state for that. Or at most, it's like a protein, and I'm interested in this particular part of it. So I see quantum science, I see optimization, but when it goes beyond that, I think the whole data aspect of quantum may be an obstacle for a good while.
Yeah, one comment I would make about optimization, the market studies I've seen say that it's going to represent somewhere between 25% to 33% of the market out there, of the application. So it is a fairly significant approach. The D-Wave claims, and I can't say that I can verify this, but they claim that a quantum annealer will always be better than the gate-based machines for optimization problems. And that they give arguments about the fact that when you have these hybrid algorithms, QA, OA, and others, that there's a lot of delays in the classical interactions. So they believe that quantum annealing will always be better. But the other question is, there's a lot of innovation in what I would call classical annealing too. Things like the Fujitsu digital annealer, which is a classical machine, and will they be able to do better than all the advances that are happening in classical? We'll just have to wait and see.
I was listening into the conference yesterday, and people were talking about this and that, about optimization applications, and I just was conscious that even though a lot of the time people were saying the right thing, that it must have been very confusing for someone that couldn't pick themselves between, well, were they really talking about quantum inspired optimization on a classical device, or were they talking about the annealing heuristic doing optimization? And then you had other people saying, yeah, there really does seem to be obstacles for NISC gate model machines managing to deliver with QAOA, and even the fault tolerant gate model machines. It looks like current architectures, there'll be too much overhead to deliver on optimization algorithms that only have a quadratic speed up. And it's quite a complicated story. There's all of these different bits, and it's a big important area, because if you look at business applications, there's so many of them, so many of the sectors. It's optimization's the obvious thing you can try to do, and I do think we're not past it being a very confusing part of the dialogue, and you've got to be conscious that when one player tries to explain it to a customer, that they're often simply explaining it from their point of view in terms of how their particular technology interacts with that. But all of these other things are potentially legitimate things for companies to be trying.
To the extent that, I cannot personally verify D-Wave's claim that annealers are going to be useful, more useful than gate model systems for optimization problems. But to the extent that that claim makes sense, there is kind of a classical parallel to this, and this is a massive generalization, but stay with me on this. When you look at a classical CPU, fundamentally, this by heritage is an adding machine. When you attach a program to a debugger, you're going to get the same 6 instructions for about 60-80% of the time. It's add, store, load, branch, what have you. So there's a bunch of things that have been bolted onto classical CPUs. They're nice to have, but fundamentally, this is still an adding machine. And then in the 90s, you wound up in GPUs because, as it turns out, basic adding machines are not particularly good at geometry. So you get things like that. And then about 5-6 years ago, you started to see a lot of AI ML accelerators, because as it turns out, GPUs, while great for parallelism, aren't really great for matrices. And so when you look at these three things, they're just new devices that let you do a different type of math a little bit better, a little bit faster. And you may want to break out annealers as kind of the fourth wave of compute, and maybe a gate model quantum system could be a fifth wave of compute. But fundamentally, these are just things that let you do math a little bit better, a little bit faster. And keeping that in mind, there's still the need to develop software that really harnesses the capabilities of these things. But this is what it is.
To reinforce your point, we also happen to be in the post-Moore's law world, where you can't just wait 6 more months and you're twice faster because the semiconductor industry does it. You've now really are hitting that sort of a wall where architectural innovation has to be the way you get speed. And if you're innovating architecturally, you can now open the door to any other kind of architecture, not just semiconductor. So I see mixed signals where analog and digital work together. Then you get quantum analog, then you get quantum digital. And that 2x2, analog, digital, classical, quantum, is a good way of tracking all these new technologies that are coming in. And like you're saying, so we can now envision a world where different architectures are touching different parts of a problem and making it go faster, but together the whole problem goes faster in a kind of a heterogeneous sort of a way. So in that sense, I think quantum computing is just another kind of an accelerator for another part of the problem. And thankfully, the quantum computing world gets that and is happy with it. The GPU folks had an identity crisis. Am I a coprocessor? Am I a real processor? I really want to be a real processor. And that actually was not productive. But the other thing is that the nature of the problem has to change now. So the way GPUs do parallel processing is different than the way multiprocessors do. It's the way GPU does it is different than the way FPGAs do. And I think to kind of grok exactly what kind of a problem a quantum computing is good at is, I think, to be done yet. It's not a common understanding like it is with GPUs and multiprocessors, etc. Even FPGAs, I've said this a few times, most people that I talk to really don't know when to use an FPGA versus a GPU. They're not the same thing. You cannot run the same program the same way. Even if all is written in Python, you have to reformulate the problem to feed the data in a different way. So that, I think, is a really critical piece that's going to define what applications are going to be real when on what architecture.
So we only have a couple of minutes left, and allow me to enter the last of our four contenders here in this discussion of are we closer to R or to the, I shouldn't even say it, the other side of R&D. Big Blue, the flag bearer of pure quantum computing, with an announcement on their roadmap, basically modular and network processors and some software and tools around it, that they believe will bring them to 4,000 or more qubits and good qubits very, very fast. Doug, I know that you talk and think about IBM and with IBM a lot. Is this the solution? What would Scorpion, if they were to short IBM Q, what could they possibly write?
Well, I think Scorpion would find it a little bit hard. The thing that IBM has going for it is they've been pretty public about their roadmap. They published the first roadmap, I think, in 2019, and they've been able to hit all the milestones that they said. Their last release was a 127 qubit machine. They just released in December. They said they were going to do it in 2021, and they barely made it by a few weeks in December. But they have a pretty good track record, and I got to give them credit for that. So they've extended their roadmap to 2025 with that 4,000 qubit machine. I will caution people that just because they say they will develop a machine does not necessarily mean that it will be public and on the cloud at that time. It may be only working in their lab. We'll have to see how this works out. But I would just want to mention that if you go back to the prediction that I made at Q2B in December, that multiprocessing would be a big thing and be one of the key developments in quantum. We just saw two examples of that with IBM and Rigetti. And again, I think we'll see more of that. I think that will be a key technology going forward for the entire quantum industry.
If I could just, I really like the IBM roadmap. I think it's great. They're working on a whole series of the right things to be working on. To be honest, though, I probably would say I think it's still the R, because it's a real challenge for them to get all of those pieces, and they've got great pieces. They've got a new line on their roadmap, which is all about improved fidelity, the Falcon or the Heron architecture, I think they call it. They've got the chip connectors. They've got longer range interconnectors. Really still in their infancy. These technologies that they're necessary for that the vision, and the one Doug's referring to, that you're gonna modularize out. But getting all of those to work with the required fidelity, I think we're going to be looking at great progress along that, and all very valid engineering progress. But is that going to be a 4,000 qubit machine that clients can actually use to do something, or is it still? I think that's still. I wanted to flag, though, that very much the area Shahin was just describing, the different ways you have classical and quantum, classical compute interacting with different types of processors. I think that's one of the other things that I thought was very impressive about the IBM roadmap, is it's much more explicit in articulating those different layers at which you need to interact the classical and the quantum compute, you know, at the control level for the processor, but also at a higher level where you're actually creating this, you know, all of the resources and architecturing all the resources you need to bring to bear at a specific problem, which could be the different types of compute processor that Shahin was describing earlier. And I thought that was very interesting to see as well.
You know, in general, I'm very positive on IBM. I think from executing on the roadmap to sharing the roadmap to open sourcing their software to building a community, they're hitting a lot of the right marks and executing really well. And I applaud them for that. To contributing to the space with things like quantum volume and now with CLOPS that are pretty valid ways of going after performance metrics. All of that is really quite wonderful. Now, their roadmap has always looked ambitious to me and a stretch goal, but the fact that they're going for it, they've executed and they're doubling down on it is very encouraging. So I applaud them, and I think because it is ambitious and stretch, I'd be happy if it's in the lab somewhere, but it's there. You know, I don't look at their roadmap and I say, oh, that means they're going to ship a box to somebody at that. No, I think that just getting to that point is really quite significant. And they've got all the other pieces. And of course, as I like to say, we have to remember that they're IBM and they can always go do acquisitions. They can always go, you know, fortify their offerings with different technologies and different modalities. So I expect that they'll remain a big player for a good while. Yeah.
We are out of time, unfortunately. Doug, you have one final word?
Yeah, just one final word on all the roadmaps. So we heard with the past week or so, new roadmaps from IBM, Rigetti, and IonQ. And, you know, all those, of course, are talking about increased scale, but at the same time, they're also talking about increased qubit quality, better fidelity metrics. And, you know, that's sort of like walking and chewing gum at the same time. It is not easy to innovate and make improvements in both areas simultaneously, but that's what needs to be done. So I applaud all those companies for seeing that and for working on that.
45 minutes, we failed again, but nothing but facts and insights and a little bit of controversy. If you would like to keep the conversation going, feel free to reach out to any of us. We always love to chat. Next time, if there are no big announcements, I think we might be talking about quantum and data potentially, a topic Shahin floated, but we will see what the next 4 weeks in the quantum universe bring. This concludes season 1, episode 4 of the Quantum Analyst Roundtable. Round and round we go. Round and round we go. You can find each individual analyst research and analysis online at quantumworlddetangled.com. We hope to see you soon. This concludes the Analyst Roundtable. Quantum is coming.